see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Lee Charles Kelley. Thanks, Lee, for joining me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so Lee, you're a dog trainer, and you've written articles about, well, you're right, you're a prolific writer, actually, and you have a blog on Psychology Today called My Puppy, Myself, How Dogs Make Us Human. And you've also written some about empathy in dogs, and there's been a couple articles out on the internet about empathy in dogs, and you've kind of reposted or kind of replied to them on your site. So that's a little bit what we wanted to talk about, was just getting your insights about empathy in dogs. And I can actually show you, maybe you can kind of just introduce yourself a bit more. I have your website and your blog here, and I can show that while maybe you give a bit more of an introduction.
Sure. I've been training dogs for sometime over, I don't know, over 20 years. I sort of divided into, I actually really started training in my mind when after I read a book called Natural Dog Training, written by Kevin Dean, who did a guest post on my blog at psychologytoday.com, also about empathy recently. And his approach to dog training was so much different than anything else. At first, I thought he was nuts, and I almost threw the book out the window. But then I started trying his techniques, and it was amazing. So anyway, I've been doing that for about 20 years, and I've been studying dogs for quite a bit longer than that. I had a dog before that who was on the David Letterman show, not as a stupid pet trick. He was. I had an agent for him. His name was Charlie. He was an English setter, and he was very beautiful. And one day, a woman on the street said, "I'm an agent. I would love to represent your dog." So I said, "Sure." And she called me like a couple of weeks later and said, "You're on the Letterman show. You have to go over there this afternoon." So he ended up doing this little bit that fell flat, but the audience loved him. So then Letterman wanted him to come back and just roam around the studio on various occasions. He became known as Charlie the Bubble-Eating Dog. So that's when I started getting interested in dogs. Was really interested was when I had Charlie. That was back in 1989.
So you really got into training. You've been training for 20 years, you're saying?
Yeah.
And kind of training other people's dogs, or having classes and that kind of stuff?
I do classes. I do one-on-one training, either with the owner or with the dog. And you know, sometimes I do, like, I work with the dog personally. Sometimes I teach the people how to work with the dog. And I've also been very interested in studying the nature of animal behavior, consciousness, and various levels of consciousness and intelligence for many years, which I was, you know, interested in mainly I wanted to know how dogs tick, what makes them tick, and how they really think and operate. And the more I look into it, the more amazing it is to me.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned that you have been reading up on the science of it and really kind of digging into it then.
Yes.
And so you're seeing the scientific part, as well as you have all this hands-on experience as well that you bring to the discussion.
Right. Yeah, I do a lot of research, and I'm constantly observing dog behavior and the behavior of people towards their dogs, which you get a lot of. I live in New York City, so you get a lot of that here. You get an opportunity to. It's a great scientific workshop in that way.
When you say New York City, that's Manhattan, or?
Yes.
Okay. They're in Central Park, or?
I'm close to Central Park. I'm not too far away.
Oh, great. So, well, this is a great topic because, you know, I remember as a kid I had a dog, and it was like a great companion, and it was probably when he died, it was one of the most you know, traumatic experience. I think that's an experience a lot of people have with, you know, when their first pet dies. And crying like all over the place for quite a while.
Yeah, I firmly believe that we actually feel the loss of most of us feel the loss of a pet more than we do of a family member or a close friend in some cases, and I think that's because we and our family members, we and our friends, we have ego boundaries, but there's no ego boundary between you and your dog.
Yeah.
So it's a deeper loss, I think.
Yeah, well, that's, I've created different causes on my website. One cause is let's find 1 million people to build a culture of empathy. And I think that has, about 18,000 people signed up. Where I create a cause for empathy, with animals. And that has it has almost 30,000 people. And I started after the first, the other one. So it's like people, love their dogs and cats and their pets, and it's a really big part of people's lives. So what I thought we could talk about here is you have a series of articles and replies to articles and so forth on your blog. And it's about empathy in animals or empathy in dogs. And maybe you could kind of go through the narrative of the different articles and kind of how you're seeing it. Because I think it started with you had one, the canine-human bond, empathy in rats, altruism in wolves.
Oh, right.
And I think that's the first one that I saw that you started talking about empathy. And
yeah, I may have talked about I've talked about empathy and altruism a lot because it's a popular subject right now in the scientific community, and it has to do, the impetus for it is that supposedly the process of evolution doesn't account for empathy and compassion because it's supposedly a dog-eat-dog world, and so empathy is not an adaptive sort of behavior or an adaptive emotional or cognitive ability. And so compassion would fall into that category as well. So yeah, the study on empathy in rats, well, it was a bit of a stretch to call what the rats were doing empathy. I don't really remember all the details of it, but my take on the that particular study was that they were exaggerating, or they weren't interpreting the results necessarily in the way I would have done. Of course, I'm not a scientist, so what do I know? But I will say one thing that's very interesting. There is, as far as I know, there's only one study so far, and it comes out of Canada, where they discovered altruistic behavior in plants. There's a species of plant called the impatiens plant. And what they did was they put it in a situation where it could, it would be with plants of its own kind, or it would be with plants that might take over the particular place that it was in. And the impatiens plant seemed to share resources with its own kind and to block plants not of its own kind from access to letting their roots come into the ground or access to sunlight. They seem to be actually behaving in an altruistic fashion.
Kind of in an in-group way, though. In-group and out-group plant. It's like what plant is...
Right. So what I was thinking was that, I don't know if that's exactly altruism, but it certainly is interesting that plants would, that at least one species of plant would be able to recognize, they don't have a nervous system. They don't have minds per se. These are plants. And yet they can recognize their kin and recognize their non-kin and behave in a way that benefits their gene pool, but not the gene pool of the other species of plant.
Well, the rat study, as I recall it, they put one rat into a tube, a plastic tube, and then had a kind of a barrier gate on it, a door, and then there was so it was enclosed. Then there was another rat that was free to run around the cage,
Yes.
And the rat that was free actually went and freed the rat that was caged, I mean trapped in there. So the idea is that it was picking up the distress of the rat.
Right.
And they actually chose to help the other rat, even if they had a choice. They could eat some, chocolate chip cookies or something and help their buddy, and they actually would help the buddy. And there's been other studies, like with monkeys, where if they have two monkeys in a cage, and if the monkey in one cage starts eating this food, it gives a shock to the other monkey. And they found that the monkey would resist eating for like days instead of contributing. Right. So there's kind of like studies like that. So, but what I'm hearing you say is that you're kind of skeptical about that's really empathy. You're thinking that's something else.
Well, you had, I believe you had Franz de Waal on the Skype, and he's somebody who has sort of redefined empathy. He wrote a paper, I think, in 2002, which kind of redefined empathy so that it included not what we normally can, perceive of as empathy, which is the ability to put oneself in another person's or another animal's emotional shoes, so to speak. But it's just the ability to perceive distress or feel something that the other is feeling. I don't remember exactly what his three categories of empathy are. But what I'm saying about my skepticism is that the word is being broadened to include things that don't require higher levels of cognition. That's all I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And there are others who responded to that empathy in rats study in the same way. There's a researcher who's working with chimps down at LSU, Daniel Pavanelli, who wrote a very scathing review of that rat study. Because it just depends on what your definitions are. Mm-hmm. I certainly believe, and since plants can feel kinship with one another, I certainly believe rats can feel, feelings that when something happens to the other rat that's as shocking as that is, that this would be distressful to them. I don't have any problem with that idea, but I don't think they see themselves as separate, so I don't think it's really true empathy in that respect. Mm-hmm. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, we're really getting down to the kind of the nuanced definitions, and it gets pretty subtle in some cases. But I think the way that Franz de Waal is defining empathy, he has the Russian doll model.
Right.
So it's varying traits that kind of build on each other, and there's kind of like evolutionarily,
right.
Basic traits get evolved, and then kind of another layer gets on that, another layer on the basic mechanisms of empathy. So you get pretty nuanced into, what's going on at a, neurological level.
Right. Well, yes, I think he's right in that there are emotional and neurological substrates that support the higher forms of cognition and evolution. For instance, there's a process called pattern recognition, which many animals have, and I think it's an evolutionary precursor or substrate to logic and language. You can't use logic and language unless you can recognize patterns first. And so I think it operates on that same nested kind of thing that de Waal is talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it seems that, for example, dogs might have like the basic, would be maybe the mirrored empathy, that emotional contagion type empathy, yeah. But they don't have, there's the kind of the perspective taking, which
right.
is the test that kind of comes in with, can you recognize yourself in the mirror?
Yes.
And children at about 18 months or 2 years or whatever, they can start recognizing that they are that person in the mirror, which I happen to have here as a mirror. So I recognize that is me in the mirror over there.
Right.
So it's my reflection, my reflective mirrored empathy going on there.
Well, there's another piece to that, which is that before you can have, well, yeah, that's having a sense of self-recognition is that, but the sense of self seems to involve a certain class of neurons in the brain called the von Economo neurons, which are spindle cells. And they've researched this and found that they exist in large quantities in certain parts of the human brain, lesser quantities in chimps, lesser quantities still, I mean, much lesser quantities in chimps, and much lesser still in gorillas. And they checked a bunch of mammals, including dogs, and they didn't find any of these self-awareness type neurons in the dogs. And it's not just there's another piece to it, which is that certain psychiatric disorders, which involved not having a very strong sense of self, they find that there are very fewer of these neurons in the brain. And when someone has hyper sense of self, they have more of these neurons in their brain. So, so that's another piece to look at in terms of whether you're going to look at empathy as being able to recognize distress in another as another being separate from yourself, which I don't think dogs do. I don't think dogs see themselves as separate from their people.
Well, I just brought up Franz de Waal's model here, his Russian doll model, and maybe I'll even show that as we're real quick. I showed your website, and so far I have a capacity just to show that on the screen here. And so what he has is kind of at the basic level is state matching. So he calls that emotional contagion. So that's like animals that are kind of group animals, zebra, they're in a herd. And then if one is frightened, like a lion is coming, that fear, you can see that fear kind of resonate throughout the whole herd. And they're all immediately on alert. And they're picking that up at kind of this, at this kind of basic, I guess, state matching. That's how I'm kind of understanding.
Right. And then, you can see that, you can actually almost see a ripple effect happening where it's almost like, a wave function on one of those machines that shows wave functions.
Yeah, maybe that's what, you see fish in a swarm, or, bees, or somehow they're kind of matching each other's state, and that emotion is kind of transferring through, through different mechanisms. I think, it might be something around mirror neurons. Maybe there's, it might be part of it in terms of you feel, the emotions within someone else, and that kind of comes across. But anyway, the second part
I've certainly seen that in dogs at the dog run on occasion, where the dogs will just be playing or hanging out, not playing and not doing anything. And a particularly nervous dog comes through the gate, and one of the dogs goes over there and has a reaction to that dog, and suddenly all the dogs, every dog in the dog run, is chasing that one dog. One poor little dog whose owner's terrified that something terrible is going to happen. Well, the dog is terrified too, but they're acting like a pack of wild dogs. I mean, I'm laughing, but it's just at the language, not at the event itself, because it's very stressful and traumatizing for the dog. But I've seen that happen at dog runs, and that's the same kind of emotional contagion I think that you're talking about.
So that one dog is kind of on edge, and then it passes through to all the other dogs, and then they see that one is I don't know if it's a threat or an outsider or weak. Yeah,
well, I don't think they see it in terms of threat or outsider. I think they see it in terms of I suddenly don't feel stable, and that's the source of my instability. And so it's an attempt. It's being put into a unstable emotional state, and then trying to find a mechanism to restore stability. That's what I think it is.
Mm-hmm. And how does the stability get restored? What's happened? What happens usually to restore stability? What's going on? What's the dynamics that you see?
Well, that's an interesting question. In that particular case, I think it's like a sudden explosion, and then just sort of ripples itself out. It's sort of, the waves sort of peter out. In a good scenario, in a bad scenario, the dog gets attacked. But there are people there to interpose another type of top-down structure rather than what's happening with the animals.
Okay, so in Duvall's model here, the second part, we had the state matching, and then the second part was sympathetic concern, and he said, and it's a sub topic of consolation. So I think he talks about you pick up the distress of others, and then you have a desire, to want to console them. So it's a little bit like compassion. And if you do, I've done searches like image searches on the internet, on compassion. And the picture, primary picture for compassion is someone kind of in distress with someone with their arm over them, a child or a friend or a soldier, another soldier, there's a whole variety of this. It's just someone's kind of feeling in distress, in pain, someone doing kind of consolation. And I think Duvall, showed, like chimpanzees kind of consoling some, another chimpanzee, for example, that lost a fight or something like that. And then the third part is perspective taking.
Right.
And that seems to be, the perspective taking seems to be the kind of the more, cognitive, self-awareness. And those tests seem to come with, there's a variety of tests just kind of showing self-awareness and being able to say, oh, that person is a separate being. And it seems to be based on that self-awareness, and dogs don't have that, so they won't recognize themselves in the mirror. So it seems that...
Well, it's more than just recognizing yourself in the mirror. What they do is they anesthetize the animal and then put a mark on the animal's face, and then when the animal revives and looks in the mirror, if the animal looks at the face... I mean, I think they look at themselves in the mirror first, and they do it with this thing, and they don't recognize what that thing is on its face. So it's more than just recognizing themselves in the mirror, because a lot of people believe that their dogs recognize themselves in the mirror, and there's an extra added thing that the scientists do with the mirror test that is missing from that layperson's perspective on what their dog is capable of perceiving. I'm not going to argue with people that say that their dogs really are recognizing themselves in the mirror, because I don't know. Some dogs might be able to do that. I don't know.
Well, there's been tests, the chimps, dolphins, elephants. So there's been that mark. So that's kind of been shown. So I think that's kind of like the basic framework of empathy. For myself, I have kind of a definition of empathy as 4 parts. There's self-empathy, so that's sensory awareness of what's going on inside of ourselves. And then there's mirrored empathy through kind of also called, it's kind of like the emotional contagion, or emotional empathy, it's called by the academics. Affective empathy, but it's just using through mirror neurons that we kind of mirror, what's going on in others. I see you shaking your head, and my mirror neurons are firing, kind of simulating that. So I get a sense of the, how fast you're shaking, and I can get a sense, a little bit of the, the energy. I can get a sense of a bit of the emotions that you have behind your actions. Then the third part is kind of with this perspective taking, but I call it imaginative empathy, that we kind of can imagine ourselves in someone else's situation. And the fourth is empathic action, that as we kind of line up with others and feel, who they are, and we kind of hold our common humanity together, It's how we work together to take kind of action together. So it might be I've seen it especially in mediation when two people are in conflict. There are, you know, big walls between them. They're mad at each other, and then you kind of empathize with each one. They start calming down. You get them to dialogue with each other and start empathizing, and they start seeing, you know, kind of the deeper feelings of what's going on, and then something kind of clicks where they kind of really start, you know, find their shared feelings or shared humanity or shared values. And then the last part in mediation is, well, what do we do now? And then they start putting together a plan, like, well, I'll do this if you do that. And that's kind of what I would consider the empathic action, is where the blocks to action are removed. The things that are blocking the empathic connection between people have been kind of removed, and you're kind of working together in kind of a more harmonious. So that's kind of the basic framework I'm using. So I don't know how that kind of resonates with you.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's good. The interesting thing about dogs and the relationship with humans, which developed before dogs were dogs, back when they were wolves or proto-dogs, is that the two species, the human and the canine, share a common behavioral adaptive strategy, which is hunting large prey animals, animals that are larger and more dangerous than themselves. And that's fairly rare in nature. Orcas do it in the ocean. They work together to hunt baleen whales and other kinds of whales. Some whales, some actual whales, not orcas, are a type of dolphin. Well, they're from the same family as dolphins. But some types of whales do work cooperatively to hunt small fish, to get fish into their mouths by circling around them, and various. There was a thing on PBS recently that shows some various really amazing kinds of cooperation between these animals. But the thing about dogs is that they have this cooperative instinct that comes from the way wolves hunt, and that probably the reason that dogs became domesticated was because dogs and humans share that same need, or that same behavioral trait. So I think that kind of falls in line with what you're saying about group action. I don't know if it's group empathy, because it's not very empathetic towards the moose or the elk, but there's a group, and it's more. I think it's more than group contagion, because within the wolf pack, what you have happening is not everybody has the same emotional valence at any given point. It's not like that it's rippling through everybody. Everybody has their different emotional valence, but they have the same goal. And so that's kind of similar to what you were saying about people who are not a cohesive group, and then they talk, and then the empathy starts to happen, and they take action. So that sort of reminds me of the way wolves hunt, and we see that echoed in the way that dogs relate to their owners and to people in general. I was talking to my sister last night, and she told me a story. She lives out in Utah. She told me a story that she'd seen on the news somewhere, where a man was lost in the desert, and a dog found him. And he was very happy to see the dog, and the dog was very happy to see him, and then the dog disappeared. And the reason the dog disappeared is because he went to find help. You know, and that's an amazing thing. That how does the dog know to do that? He hasn't been trained to do that. He's just a dog. I don't think he was a search and rescue dog or any kind of a, you know. There was a story up in Minnesota a couple of years ago. A man took his very old Vizsla dog for his late night walk, or her late night walk, and she started pulling him in the other direction, pulling him way far off their usual route to several blocks away, where there was a man having a heart attack in his driveway, and they called the paramedics and saved the guy's life. You know, and how do dogs know how to do that? I mean, you could classify that as empathy certainly in one of possibly in one of those nested doll types, but I think it's yeah, I think it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen so many different stories like that. There's one video out on YouTube of a dog that got hit on the freeway, and then you see another dog go and it actually pulls that other dog off the freeway.
Yes.
So
there was one in Chile. There was one in Chile and one in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
2 videos of that. Yeah.
Well, when you mentioned the pack, you know, working together as a pack to bring down, you know, larger animals. I know with empathy, they always talk about that it was developed for, you know, mothers nurturing, you know, the babies and needing that empathic connection. But I think another part is that, you know, as humans we're kind of in terms of pack, working as a pack to bring down animals, they needed to work together to kind of coordinate their action and to create that perspective of, I know where that person is, I know what their intention is, because if I was in their situation, I would be doing this too. So there's a real, you know, the better you are at kind of coordinating and working together in a coordinated team, the easier it would be and the more effective it would be to, you know, take down, you know, a mammoth or whatever.
Right. Right, and it's that cooperation that then has the potential for taking empathy out of the mother-child relationship and maybe even transferring it into something like developing trade with other tribes rather than being at war with other tribes.
Yeah. So it can kind of become a cross between all humans. We can have that, and even from humans to animals to dogs. Right. So that capacity. Well, that's the thing we really wanted to explore here. We've kind of set the groundwork. I thought we could go through, you know, your articles. Maybe you could give a bit of a review of each one. It's the first. I think the discussion might have started with the Debbie Custance study on empathy-like responding in dogs to distress in humans. And then Stanley Coren replied with, your dog really does care if you're unhappy. And then you replied to that, do dogs have empathy, or is it a sixth sense? And then there was a reply to that by Kevin Behan, is that?
Yes, I don't know, that's how I say his name.
Okay.
I mean, I've known him for years, and I don't really know, because various people pronounce it differently, but I call him Kevin Behan.
Okay. And actually, I'm going to be talking to him in about an hour and a half. So.
Oh, good.
We should
I can't wait to see that interview.
We should all get together and, you know, have a panel on this too.
Yes, we should.
And then and his was called Empathy and Evolution: How Dogs Convert Stress into Flow. So do you want to just go through each of those articles and just kind of give your take on it, kind of the narrative of the discussion?
Sure. The one from England, written by Deborah Custance, and again, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. What they essentially did was they set up a situation where they went into a person's home so that it was a comfortable situation for the dog, and the researcher and the dog owner sat about 3 yards apart or so, had a conversation, and at some point they would either start humming or whatever to see what the dog would do, and at another point they started pretending to cry to see what the dog would do. And the dog most often responded to the pretend crying by going to the person that was crying and wagging their tail or putting their head in the lap or whatever, which was described as an empathy-like behavior. And my main issue with the study is that since empathy is about connecting to or feeling or resonating with or responding to the emotional state of another being, and if they're pretending to cry, where's the empathy in pretend crying? That's a behavior, that's not an emotion. So we don't know whether the people that were doing the pretend crying, they're, ostensibly they're not Meryl Streep. So when they're crying and they're pretend crying, the dog is probably responding to the behavior rather than to the emotion, unless the emotion was there, and we don't know if the emotion was there. So that's all. That was my main point. But then I said in that article that I think dogs do tune in. They have an emotional attunement with people. And I'm at the top. I started that article with the quote from Brian Wilson, who, the Beach Boys, who wrote Good Vibrations. That when he was a kid, his mom told him and his brothers that dogs can tell when someone has a good vibration and a bad vibration. And certainly I get enough opportunity in New York City to see dogs respond to a bad vibration in some joker on the street that's not hooked up right. That happens from time to time, in the city. And I've also seen dogs who suddenly relate with amazing happiness and joy and friendliness with a total stranger, just because they sometimes feel a connection there. So I think there's something that goes on that is it. I call it a sixth sense because I think the dogs do have a sense of the feeling states of other beings, and it doesn't come through cognitive awareness. It probably comes through, and my supposition, my hypothesis, if you will, is that there are a great deal of nerve endings in the alimentary canal, the stomach, the colon, etc. And 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the stomach, or in the alimentary canal, which is a neurochemical that's connected to mood, learning, emotion, etc. And and there's the solar plexus has a lot of nerves in the solar. There's a lot of nerves in the solar plexus, and it operates independently of the central nervous system. So, and I'm not the only one to suggest that there's something in what they call the second brain, the solar plexus, that maybe acts like an organ of being able to sense the emotional states or the feeling states of other animals or other people. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it's well, I could start with
I don't think it's a sixth sense in the terms of what they study at Duke University, where they have the cards and one person in the room is trying to send a mental image of the card to the other person, and it never seems to work. I think it's a sixth sense in the same way that vision and hearing and taste and tactile and all those others, but it's a way of sensing emotions rather than seeing things or hearing them or whatnot.
Yeah, so it's like somehow those dogs are picking up emotional feelings, and how are they doing it? And are they doing it with smell? Are they doing it with their sight? Are they feeling it?
I think
are they tasting it? Is there something in the solar plexus where it's kind of like they're feeling something come through there? Or...
Right. And I think it's like a step above the emotional contagion thing, where all the dog run and you see that ripple effect through the zebras, etc. Because I don't think they're in a state of emotional contagion with the joker on the street that's just not hooked up right. It's not contagion. They feel what he's feeling, but they don't
like it.
They don't want to feel it. They don't resonate with it. They kind of are trying to resonate away from it, if you ask me. So it's a step above the emotional contagion in my book.
Well, you started with talking about the study with Debbie. I actually have an interview with her. I don't know if you saw that, but
no, I didn't see that.
Yeah, it's like an hour interview. We kind of went through her study. And so what she's really looking at, it seems to me, is in that model, the Russian doll model of empathy from Franz de Waal, would be sympathetic concern, I think.
Right.
It's that you're feeling the dog's, I mean, that's what they're speculating, okay? The dog is feeling the distress, and that they're wanting to console the person that's feeling stress.
I understand that, but my question is, what distress are they feeling if the person is not really distressed but is
Right.
pretending to be
Yeah, that's what I was
distressed?
going to get to, is that you're saying that, well, it's an actor. The person is pretending, and maybe the dog sees through the act, right? Right? It's like
Well,
maybe the actors haven't done the Lee Strasberg, you know,
that's right.
or maybe the actor was really good and kind of remembered,
Well,
a real, memory of being
yeah,
distressed. Maybe they
possible. I don't
remembered
know.
my dog dying, and then they were tapping
Well,
into that and it was really bringing up. So we don't quite know. That would be an
right.
interesting question.
I think that would be the next prerequisite for a study like that, is to know what the emotional valences are of of the people. And interestingly enough, I don't know if I mentioned this in that article, but there was a study done on emotional contagion, I guess, but not exactly. They showed they had people with brain caps on, for the MRIs or whatever, and they showed them a movie, and they registered how the brain waves were acting, and at certain points of the movie, certain members of the audience had the same brainwave patterns. And they were usually people who consider themselves to be empathetic towards others, or else that knew each other, that were somehow had a history of interacting and sharing emotions or whatnot. What really fascinated me was that the brain patterns were the same at these key moments in the story.
Yeah.
The high
Mhm.
emotional moments of the story.
Yeah, the emotion they're able to see. I mean, there's tests like that, right, where they inflict pain on someone, they see what lights up, what areas light
Yeah,
up.
yeah,
On me, they'll test that.
right,
Then they inflict the same pain on you, and they see how my brain is lighting up, and the
right,
same regions light
yeah,
up, or they match the regions lighting up in you and the regions lighting
right.
up with me. So they're doing
That's
all kinds
amazing,
of,
amazing stuff. And so
yeah,
what Deborah Custance needs to do is to get the dogs with an
yeah.
MRI thing on their head, and the owner with the MRI thing on their head, and see if there's mutual brain waves. But who knows? The human brain is much more complicated than the dog. The cortex of the human brain
Yeah, I
is much
think I
more
saw somewhere
complicated.
that they were training some dogs to do that, and they'd gotten some dog. I just barely remember that. So I guess
Yes.
what my question would be is, from you who've dealt with a lot of dogs, have you seen consolation behavior in the work that you've done, or something that's kind of like similar? You know what I mean? It's like
Oh yeah.
dogs that,
I think most dog owners or dog people will tell you that the dog will comfort them when they're not feeling well, or seem to console them. Um, yeah, I think that's a very common behavior, which is probably what motivated those British researchers to set up the study in that way. But the question is the dog? I mean, I have no doubt that dogs can feel what we're feeling. Um, but the question is the dog consoling the person, or is the dog consoling, is the dog trying to create a mutual feeling of more relaxation in the whole group? If the dog doesn't see itself as separate from the owner, and we know that on a certain level the owner doesn't see itself separate from the dog, because that's why they grieve so much when the dog dies. They've lost a part of themselves, not to mention a best friend.
well, it would
So
be. Oh,
there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of layers to this
hmm.
that you can either apply to it or peel away, and it's difficult to know some of these things.
Well, the thing is interesting to me is kind of the anecdotal part to it, because I mean, kind of what you're bringing to this discussion is just all your years of, intimate, experience and study of seeing the
But
dogs in so many different situations. So you're able to bring that, that wealth of experience, to the discussion.
but then on the other hand, I've I've seen a dog who, when the owner was in distress and crying and inconsolable, the dog brings her a toy. The dog doesn't come over and cuddle up with the person. The dog brings her a toy, ostensibly well, but because the dog knows that playing makes the owner happy, or maybe it's just that the dog feels that's, I don't know, that's how to get the emotion moving. I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's not a very clear-cut thing, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're kind of exploring here, is to see what kind of light we can shed. It does remind me of babies. Now, if babies would be in a similar situation as a dog, right? They don't have that sense of self-awareness. And one thing I've noticed is that sometimes they get a little nervous. You know, everybody wants to hand you their baby, right, to hold. And it's like, and then I get kind of nervous. Am I going to do this right? And I've noticed that when I get nervous, the baby gets nervous too and starts crying. And so it's a little bit like that emotional contagion, that the baby, you know, doesn't know that it's different from me, you know, have that sense of self-awareness. But somehow it's picking up my feelings, I think, and then it feels maybe my distress, because I feel nervous about, oh, I'm going to do this wrong. I can viscerally feel my nervousness, and then I'm even nervous that, well, I'm going to pick up the baby and it's going to cry, and everybody's going to look at me and think I'm not doing it right, you know. So that adds to another level of nervousness. And then it does seem like the baby picks it up, and so what I started doing recently is, instead of kind of focusing on my nervousness, I look at the baby and I try to mirror back what I'm seeing. And I've actually noticed that that's kind of helped. That the baby is more, you know, more calm. You know, I just try to make the same face it's making, or kind of energetically mirror back. So I think there's a relationship there with what's maybe happening with the dogs too.
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in your conversation with Kevin. I'll just, you know, I can give you a preview of that because, of course, he posted it through my blog at Psychology Today as a guest post, and so I read it and you know, made sure that all the commas were where they were supposed to be, et cetera, et cetera.
Before we get into that, can we talked about the Debbie's study, and then there was a Stanley Coren. You were replying. Could you maybe go through that? What his arguments were? Or?
Well, Coren's article was just basically a précis of, it was a recounting of what they had done, and he made the point initially. I don't know. I think he edited so that it's not there anymore. He made the point that empathy doesn't appear in children until they're around 4 or 5 years old. I think that's the figure that I've seen. And you know, he's you know, does impeccable research. He's a noted psychologist in Canada. Some of his stuff is in textbooks up there. So, but not on dogs, on the way the brain works to perceive things, the perceptual capabilities of the brain. And then he said something to the effect, well, you know, he believes that dogs have the same level of intelligence. Although again, he said he's been saying this for years, and now he's saying that it's the same emotional capacities as toddlers, whereas before he was saying they have the same intelligence as toddlers. So he may have restructured his thinking on that. But yeah, he just said that this suggested that maybe dogs are on a higher level than toddlers. Maybe they are at 4 or 5 years of age that we see in children if they have this capacity. But he didn't say that was for sure, and he didn't say that the study actually proved anything, as far as I can recall.
Well, his article is Canine Empathy, Your Dog Really Does Care If You Are Unhappy. New research shows that dogs respond to owners' unhappiness. So that was kind of the tagline there. And then you went into it and were saying that what you had kind of described earlier, you know, you were kind of saying that, well, maybe they weren't acting, they weren't truly expressing, the actors weren't, you know, really sending off the pheromones of distress or the actual
vibrations of. I think different emotions have different vibrations. Going back to the Brian Wilson song, you know, good vibrations. But I think different emotions have different wavelengths and different vibrations. I mean, this comes from, you know, I worked as an actor for many years. I wasn't very good at it. I didn't enjoy it as much as I probably should have, but I made a living at it. And I did study, and I did do the Stanislavski exercises, and one of them is to, you know, remember a painful event just by thinking about the sensory details surrounding the event. But so as an actor, I was always paying attention to, when I would get into an emotional state of some sort, I would pay attention to it, whether I was going to use it as in acting or because I also write fiction as well. So it's nice to have this sort of lexicon of knowledge about how emotions work, at least in you personally, not in other people. And I really was able to tell that there's a sense, there's a different sense, of a different emotion has a different feeling state, and you feel it in the body in a different way. Anger and love are very different. You feel it very differently in the body, and I think they have different wavelengths and different vibrations, just as colors do.
Yeah. There's almost like a visceral vibration level of each feeling that
yeah, if you pay attention to it, it's there to pay attention to. And many of the acting teachers I worked with said there's only one emotion, it's love, and everything else, and that's like the white light, and everything else is what gets refracted through the prism. All the other emotions are different colors of that same white light. That's a popular way of teaching acting, to talk about love is the so if you can't figure out what the emotion is in a scene, just create a feeling of love, and then you'll be angry or you'll be sad or whatever it is, because that has contained within it all the emotions, reportedly, according to the acting teachers. So, but anyway, I like that as a metaphor for this idea that emotions have different colors, so to speak, different.
Yeah, I see him as having different aesthetic. I see it as an aesthetic. It has a different aesthetic feel. Like I can feel my anxiety, and I can kind of map it out and describe it as in a 360-degree space within myself, and it has a whole aesthetic colors and vibrations, like you talk about quality. You know, like one.
Well, that's amazing.
One fear, you know, sometimes fear is like a spike, kind of like through my, you know, kind of goes through my heart. Another kind is like an anxiety, which is like a heavy, you know, kind of a numbing cloud. Kind of has, yeah, a cloud is a good metaphor. It's like a cloud that kind of weighs on me. And, you know, sometimes I can get pretty attuned to those qualities and be, you know, describe them. And I do kind of like a freestyle dance, so, you know, there's a lot of feeling and emotion, and that kind of happens in that dance.
Yeah, well, I think it's amazing that if you pay attention to the metaphors we use about emotion, that they probably are very similar to what you're talking about, because we talked about the cloud, a cloud hanging over you, all those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, I interviewed Christian Keezers, and he heads a neuroscience lab in Amsterdam, and he really goes into the nuts and bolts of the mirror neurons. So when you're saying there's something in the solar plexus, he would describe it as going into how mirror neurons work, and for him it would be those feelings that maybe you're feeling in the solar plexus, that the mirror neurons is what's tapping into those experiences. And so you are feeling it in the solar plexus, but that it's kind of initiated through mirror neurons as the, you know, the mechanism that kind of taps into the full, you know, 360-degree felt body sensations. And then there's George Lakoff, who's a linguist. And so he's done studies about metaphors, so that metaphors actually tap into or taking those experiences we have. And for example, you know, there's getting, I can't remember which one it was, but it's, you know, like getting off the path, right? And there's a visceral feeling of getting off the path and a feeling of being lost or struggling. And that becomes a metaphor of an experience that taps into our neural understanding of what that experience is like. So we kind of build these whole structures out of these metaphors, which actually have visceral kind of feelings, which, tap into the mirror neurons and that whole system. So it, starts getting kind of complex, but, they're really starting to unravel a lot of that.
Yeah, well, and Kevin has a lot of, talks a lot about the metaphors we use for emotions. And his view is that they always relate back to some form of energy.
Well, that's his article. His article, Empathy and Evolution, How Dogs Convert Stress into Flow. Each small amount of emotional connection, empathy, i.e. empathy between dogs and its owner, may very well encapsulate the overall mechanism of evolution itself. So maybe you could go a little bit into his article then, which was the last one.
Yeah, well, it's very complicated to explain in just a little short amount of time. Essentially, there's this principle, or there's this theory developed by Adrian Bejan, who is a professor of mechanical engineering at Duke University, called the Constructor Law, which puts forth the idea that everything in nature is its shape, its behavior is controlled by the dynamics of how it flows, how it doesn't flow. That whatever currents are flowing create the shape and structure of the organism, the ecosystem, the marketplace. Everything is controlled by the flow of energy through the system, or how it flows and what obstructions it comes across and whatnot. And so Kevin was applying this to the emotional nature of dogs, and saying that in fact, what we talked about earlier about the initial relationship between proto-dogs and proto-humans tens of thousands of years ago was about hunting together, and that created a spike in the evolution of both our species and their species, where we went off the charts as far as any other primates are concerned, ostensibly, possibly partially because of the relationship we had with dogs. And what he essentially said was that dogs convert stress into flow, and that interacting with humans is very stressful for those proto-dogs. And somehow they managed to turn that stress into a relationship that allowed the two species to work together, to flow together towards this common purpose. Now, if you look at the relationship between humans and wolves that we have today, it's not that dissimilar from what it was 50,000 years ago, where, first of all, dogs are very different from, morphologically speaking, and even behaviorally speaking, and probably cognitively speaking, from wolves. They've evolved quite a bit. Now, part of that could be termed to be solely about artificial selection, because we bred them for specific purposes, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what he was saying was that that because there was this difference in species, because humans are on a vertical axis and dogs are on a horizontal axis, that creates stress for the dog. He doesn't say this about the vertical and horizontal. That's my take on it. So somehow they were able to convert that stress into a working relationship, and that speeded up, or that was part of what the coevolution of the two species. And that's just a drop in the bucket of what you'll find out when you read the article. I hope people do read the article. I think it's a great article. And when you talk to him as well. But he's applying the Constructor Law to show that that the shape of the evolution of these two species has to do with how the emotions were flowing back and forth or getting impeded and then restructured in two specific ways, which go back to Adrian Bajon's initial theory, which is that flow is either laminar, where things are like this, or it's turbulent, where things are like this. So laminar flow is like that, and then turbulent flow is like rapids in a river. And laminar flow is like the various parts of the water kind of on top of each other and flowing with each other.
So yeah, it's kind of like, I mean, looking at it from a little bit different way, then it's saying that through evolution, dogs and humans have kind of evolved to work better with each other, because people that work better, dogs that work better with humans, they were kind of selected as, the ones that were probably bred the favorite dog, because this dog is so connected to working so well that it becomes favored. And so that flow, it's like, maybe it's almost like neurons, right? Neurons work through the brains. Neurons.
There's a flow of neurons through the brain, and if the flow takes place in a certain way, it restructures the brain. So there you have the Bajon's theory of Constructor Law, that flow creates the structure, because how the energy flows from one path of neurons to another changes the structure of the brain.
And the idea is that neurons that fire together, they wire together.
Yeah.
So in the same sense as animals that fire together, humans that fire together, wire together, right? As we get more energetically, mirroring each other, we kind of get closer in that sense.
So and he talks about that this has created a relationship that does indeed have a sort of sixth sense feeling to it, but it's a very old, a very evolutionarily predating any kind of cognitive sense. It's a gut feeling.
Yeah. Well, that would be the emotional contagion, which, as I understand it, is that gut feeling is the mirror neurons that's happening. It's well,
I'll have to look at that interview and read his book. Who is it that said that about the mirror neurons?
Christian Kiesers. If you check the homepage, he's pretty much on close to the top. And we actually went through his book chapter by chapter, and it's broken down by chapter. And the book is like online for download for like $4 or $5, so it's like really cheap. He really gets into the individual neurons, how they work, how they become, which neurons and why become mirror neurons. Groups of experiences, and how when you access one of the experiences, it actuates the whole group of experiences. So remember, it's like you're talking about your acting, right? You remember the experience of that, or even the smell of a conflict, and it activates the whole constellation of feelings around it, because those different senses have wired together is kind of like a bundle of experiences and stuff. So, well, this has been a fantastic discussion. Really, exploring kind of the nature and we're kind of wanting to look at how dogs and humans, the empathy between them, and it's kind of an ongoing exploration. And we had talked about doing a panel sometime. So I'll talk to Kevin and. Maybe we can get several. With Stanley, I actually have an interview lined up in September. So, but if you know other people who might be interested in a panel, get 5 of us together to talk about empathy in dogs, and especially.
Well, I don't want to speak for him, but I know that Mark Beckhoff is interested in this sort of thing.
Yeah,
Psychology Today too.
Do you know him or?
Well, he knows. Yeah, we've had conversations, and I got into trouble. I got into trouble with him because of something I wrote where I claimed that dominance is a myth, and he got very upset with that. So I had to sort of backpedal on that, but which I was happy to do. Not that I don't think dominance, the way it's applied in dog training is I think a myth, and well, that's a whole different topic.
Yeah, it is a whole different area. We'll talk about dominance and empathy at some point, because typically the idea of dominance is that empathy is inhibited through dominance. So that might be a really interesting topic. And I actually did. Mark was one of the first people I interviewed on this series. So,
okay.
Cool. I do have a web page on empathy in animals. So his interview is there, and Debbie's, and this one will be there, and we'll start building this whole sub-conference on empathy in animals and
That's
empathy
great.
in dogs. So
That's great.
I really look forward to kind of keeping this dialogue going, and we'll connect through email and line up the next panel or something.
Okay, cool.
Okay, Lee, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Had a lot of fun.
Me too.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.